Welcome to the Daily Word, verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Romans. Keep in mind, I'm using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so if you're using a different translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. All right, and now one other thing before we get started. If you like the video, hit like, and if for your YouTube viewers, if you like the channel, subscribe to the BP, the Bible Perspective. All right, we're in chapter 8. And we're going to pick it up in verse 5, but I'm going to go back to verse 4. It says, in order that the law's requirements might be accomplished in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Now, I spent a little time in the last video kind of explaining how Paul is using this phrase, walk according to, right? Because he's making a comparison. He's making a contrast. Walk according to the flesh, walk according to the Spirit. What's important to understand is that when the contrast is one is saved and the other one is not. So he's not talking about the struggle as Christians we have, the struggle that he talked about in chapter 7, when he says that when I would do good, there is another law present with me to do evil. I want to do right, but sin is there, and it's constantly battling my mind for control. So my point is, he's not talking about that here. The person who walks according to the flesh doesn't have that struggle. They're not born again. We're going to see that in a moment, but they're not born again. So there's no struggle, and what Paul is saying is that they're dominated by their flesh. And the reason why they're dominated by the flesh because there's no new man from which to pull them in the other direction. Now look at verse 5. For those who live according to the flesh, think about the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit, about the things of the Spirit. So again, he even clarifies, if you live. Now, he's not talking about a Christian who struggles with certain weaknesses. That's not what he's talking about. Because remember, the Christian who's struggling, as well as to those who are not struggling, if you are a Christian, if you are born again, he's going to clarify this in a moment. There is no condemnation. Keep that in mind. He starts off this topic, this thought, by saying there is no condemnation. So, for those who live according to the flesh, think about the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit, about the things of the Spirit. Verse 6. For the mindset of the flesh is death, but the mindset of the Spirit is life and peace. Now, let me read verse 7 again. Let me read verse 7 because, again, he gives more clarification. For the mindset of the flesh is hostile to God because it does not submit itself to God's law, for it is unable to do so. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Now again, this is a person who is not saved. They are not a Christian. That's why there's no inner struggle. So the mindset of the flesh, notice he said it's hostile to God. It can't submit to God. Now, what is Paul saying? Now, there are a lot of people, even atheists, will say, I do good. Now, what do they mean? That they do certain things good. They may not steal. They may not murder, right? But that is in no way to say that they meet the requirements of God. Notice he said, very first thing is by denying God. Denying God is a worse sin than fornication. If you think about it, okay? Well, but the first commandments is to love God with all of your heart. So that, it's just kind of amazing. Anyway, he says, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Why? They're not subject to the law of God. And the reason why is because there needs to be a change. They are in a state of death. So the sin nature dominates their life. Now notice what he says, verse 9. You, many believers, however, are not in the flesh. So again, notice the language. If as Paul is using it here, if you're in the flesh, you're not a Christian. So he says to the Christian, you're not in the flesh. Well, remember in chapter 7, he talked about the struggles and the battles we have with the flesh. Two different things. I just want to clarify that. Because there are those who read this verse, when you kind of gloss over it, you read it and you say, man, what the heck is going on? But again, carefully reading it, we can see he clarifies it. So again, verse 9, you, however, not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God lives in you. That's the difference. A true believer has the Spirit of God living in them. But he also battles. This is why we have the epic battle, the struggle between sin and righteousness. But if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he does not belong to him. In other words, a person is not a believer because of a religious affiliation, a denominational affiliation. Right? So that means there are scores of people who are a part of religion. Most of the human population are in some form of religion, right? But notice what he says right here. If you don't have the Spirit of God dwelling in you, you do not belong to him. We can make a whole lot of offenses, by the way, by that, because there are a lot of people who think they're righteous, but they're not. They think they're righteous because, well, I do certain good deeds. But your good deeds don't qualify. They don't meet God's righteous requirements. Remember that. They don't meet God's righteous requirements. Now watch this, verse 10. Now if Christ is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit of life because of righteousness. So he makes a contrast again. Now he said, notice he said, if Christ is in you, then this parenthetical statement, your body is still dead because of sin. We all know that. Our body is still corrupt. Our body still wants to sin. That's what he's saying. But the Spirit is life because of righteousness. Verse 11, and if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, then he who raised Christ from the dead will also bring your mortal bodies to life through his Spirit who lived in you. Now, we kind of got a complete picture here. When you come to faith, someone preaches the gospel to you, someone presents the gospel to you, it sparks faith. When you believe, you are born again of the Spirit of God. Let me read something quickly from John. John chapter 5. Jesus gives us sums it up right here, which is kind of always funny, because the epistles are basically the teachings of Christ explained in detail. So John chapter 5 verse 24 says, I assure you, anyone who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. Notice that, has. Remember, we said in the question about if you believe you can lose your salvation, you're not understanding this verse. See, you're not understanding this verse. Notice, I have it. I'm a believer. Person preached the gospel to me, I believe. I'm not going to get salvation. I'm not going to get eternal life. Those who believe you can lose your salvation obviously do not believe they have eternal life. But notice this. He has eternal life and will not come into judgment. Remember my first verse in Romans 8 right there? There is now no condemnation. But has, again, past tense, passed from death into life. This is so liberating. This should be setting you free. That's why I tell you why I know I'm going to heaven. I know that I know that I know I'm going to heaven. Why do I know I'm going to heaven? Because of Jesus, by the way. So verse 11 again, and if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, he who raises Christ from the dead will also bring your mortal bodies to life through his Spirit who lives in you. I'm going to get into that mortal bodies in the next video, so I'll see you then.